All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to Badger Office Hours. It is Thursday, June 23rd, and we have 7 days until one of the biggest events in Convex history. And we've got Tritium here, Professor Tritium, to walk us through what is going on and what are we doing, or how have we positioned bveCVX to kind of try to capture and grow as much as possible during this unlock. And in the process, we will highlight some of the new features that have been rolling out for bveCVX. It's a product that has undergone quite a bit of evolution since it started, and how we hope to capture as much of that convex as possible around this big unlock that's coming up. So it's an open Discord. If you want to talk, just unmute yourself. But if you're not talking, please keep yourself on mute, or else I'll mute you and then I'll have to unmute you if you want to talk. So just try to stay on mute unless you have something to say. And Tritium, without any further ado, let's hand it over. What is you want to get us started with what's happening on the 30th?
Sure. Hey everybody. Yeah. It's hot in Berlin today. Yeah. But anyway, okay. So yeah, on the 30th, basically, Convex is unlocking a lot. I'll get to that in a minute. But I think what I did last week and worked really well is, when thinking about how to develop strategies around influence plays, right? There's kind of a process that we've on the team kind of learned to go through and are thinking about for like doing an analysis and evaluating that whole situation. So I've kind of done that, took time yesterday to go and do that again all at once and like put that all together and provide a bunch of links. I'm going to take you through that, and then provide some insights and my anecdotal thoughts on stuff. And then somewhere at some point, we'll be putting out, I think, a PDF or a link to this, and there's links in all of this, so you can really go through this whole thing, click on all the links, go look at all the data yourself, right, and really think into it. And I kind of think, like right now with what's going on in DeFi and what's going on in the market, right, the key is about getting like smarter, right, and the key is about understanding what's going on and really finding the win-wins and finding the right moves. So I encourage people to, if you find this interesting, maybe take some time yourself to go through it again and try to like really wrap your head around it all and see if you can get into it. So with that, let's just kind of start with my mouse working. Yeah, okay, with what is Curve and Convex, right? So Curve, I talked about this last time, right? But Curve basically is an AMM that focuses mostly on stablecoins, and they have this thing called VE Curve, where basically you lock your Curve tokens for 4 years functionally. And then you are able to direct this purple bit of emissions, right, on their schedule, which goes for quite a long time and extends beyond this. And what you do is direct which pools that have gauges, right, the governance is approved to be able to get these emissions. With your curve, you're able to decide what that is. So like when we look at a token, really quickly, we kind of see that like Curve's a pretty big token, right? It's like 116 on CoinGecko. It's got a market cap, although I think you have to be a little careful about this number on CoinGecko, but it's got a market cap of 300 million. There's a lot of trading volume, which is a better sign that it's a living token, right? And then, I talked about this a little last week, but this circulating supply that the market cap is based off, if you click this question mark, is based on like a whole bunch of subtractions that were provided by probably the Curve team, probably a very long time ago, and they don't tend to be up to date. So this can be very wrong. And I would encourage you, and then the market cap is based off that. So when looking at this thing, what I tend to look at is, okay, like what's the trading volume? There's $104 million of this thing a day trading, right? That's intense. There's a lot of volume there, right? There's, the total supply, I think, which is like the number of tokens that are actually on chain somewhere, that's something to look at. So anyway, you get the chance. Curve is big, right? And I think the thing about Curve is that in order to use it, you have to lock your Curve, and then you can also get some extra boost on farming. But in order to do that, you have to go use this clunky interface, and it isn't really available to like multi-sigs and DAOs. So you can only do this through an EOA, in order to get the boost value from locking your curve, you need to have like a lot of curve locked and then a whole lot of tokens like farming curve in the same wallet, right? You then have to use this interface to try to figure out how to use the whole thing, right? And in the end, for any kind of an institution or a DAO, right, like they're trying to work from a multi-sig, they're trying to work through smart contracts, and so it's pretty limiting. So what happened with Curve is these are kind of this is Curve locked over time, right? And what you can see is that in about May, right, Convex popped up, and by basically, what's the word I'm looking for, like communitizing the boost or concentrating it, right? They were able to attract all this VE curve. So they said, okay, we're going to launch farms. You put your curve tokens in there and we're going to farm it for you, right? We're also going to take in V curve and lock it in a one way, like never unlocking thing. And as we get more and more curve, our boost goes up, which means that the yields on farms pay more, which means that we can take fees and still offer better yields than curve, right? Those fees can go back to pay VE curve holders, and you create this whole ecosystem that kind of like reorganizes the original VE curve system in a way that's like more functional for DAOs to use and to build liquidity, right? Which is kind of the people that would want to build liquidity. So you can see Convex launch, it was like, didn't take very long. The market was pretty like static. And then Convex came in and like things changed and they've kind of, now they kind of, from a governance point of view, while Convex cannot make a decision, right? Convex is a collection of all of the Convex holders, but Convex controls half or very close to half, more or less than half of Curve. Yeah. So I guess getting a little bit more into Convex, again, the way Convex works, you can go, here's Convex again, same thing. I think the really interesting thing is we're talking about the unlockening, right? Is Convex launched a year ago, maybe something like that, right? Like not so long ago. And for a long time at the beginning, they were emitting a lot of tokens, right? They had all these tokens out and they had this emissions curve, right? At this point, 91% of their total supply has already been emitted. So Convex has gone from a protocol that at the beginning, you know, the Convex yields on top of the extra boost were making Convex very, very appealing and creating a lot of extra yields for Curve LPs, to now, like, they're still a good protocol, right? And they're still able to provide a better yield than Curve alone or than anybody else's on Curve alone because they have the highest boost, right? But they're not emitting a whole bunch of Convex anymore, which means that if it's all locked, there's also like not a lot more going into liquidity, right? Like the market can end up pretty locked up. So I think one thing to keep in mind here is that, you know, Curve is now at 91 million out of 100 in total supply. And yeah, and then there's this locking in. So like we're working within that parameter, whereas, you know, 6 months ago when we were talking about this, the situation was pretty different. So on the Miro, I think most of the people here, I'm sure, have used Convex before. And I talked about it 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure I need to get way into it, but you know, like you can stake your CVX CRV here, right? And then these are like the yields you get from fees. You've got pools here, right? Where then these are the yields that you're getting from Curve emissions plus the extra Convex that's minted minus the fees that are going to pay the staked rewards up here. And then there's this voting process whereby you vote on a snapshot for stuff, right? And that's kind of the basic Convex thing, right? And then there's kind of llama.air force, which provides all the statistics on it anymore, right? But they kind of have then like wrapped all of this up into a flyer and basically say like, and we'll get into Votium in a minute, but like with Convex and all of the bribes and all of the incentives and their estimation of that, right? Like here's a current ROI. And then they also kind of just look at like what's coming out of CVX CRV, which, you know, this is a week old, right? But I would assume that that would be pretty much the same as this. Okay, so then Votium, right? So cool, now you've got Convex and there's all these people that were excited about it and they've farmed it and they're sitting around in Discord and they're like, hey, like our token's gonna pump when all these DAOs realize that they need it, right? And I think there were a bunch of DAOs looking at it going like, this is interesting, but it's like a pretty new token. And like, you know, like we're not, a lot of DAOs really just aren't in the position to like make quick treasury decisions. Also for us, right? The decision about spending enough money to buy a token to move markets is like a fair lunch DAO that is trying to make like open decisions is very challenging. So there's a lot of challenges there that slowed that down. And they kind of said, well, like we have all these votes and we're voting for ecosystem pools, right? Like what if we could sell votes to people? So then Votium set up this whole thing where basically DAOs could go and place bribes, right? And then people could vote on it. And if you voted on the thing that a DAO was bribing on, you got a share of it. And then the other thing that they set up was like a delegate wallet that you could delegate to them. And they would basically auto balance all of the votes across all of the bribes, such that at the end, right, you see here that like basically, there's like one fluke here that, and they do happen. And CVX here be they overvote for. Basically everything here, right, always kind of gets about the same amount, which means that as a DAO now, you can go, you can place a bribe, you're guaranteed your fair price of votes, right? And you can basically utilize Convex without having to buy the token. So interestingly, like that kicked off really fast, right? And I think if you look at the curve wars in the DAOs that are winning, Frax is really the DAO that's winning the most, right? Like they've done a very good job of using a strategy that was a combination of bribing in order to generate yields, right? Acquiring CVX largely through farming those yields themselves, right? And locking it. And so they've got this nice system, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of the story of the development of Convex. And so then here, like when thinking about Convex, and maybe I'm giving Poe too much credit, he might have found another sheet and put some data in. He can speak to that. But when we think about like influence, this is kind of how we look at it as a DAO, right? It's like, okay, like how much, if I have VE curve, how many emissions does that generate over a year, right? So if right now, based on calculations that you can go look at on this sheet, right? Like we've calculated that one VE curve, right, distributes 53 cents a year, right? And then you can look at the price of VE curve, which I think right now is like 72 cents, right? And you can say, well, if I lie and I bought the, buy and lock this curve, then it's going to take me, I don't know, like a year and a half. If you look into the sheet, it calculates this all out, and there's a lot more thinking about, how you think about it. But you can kind of get a sense of like, what's your ROI in this investment, right? And again, you can go deeper into the sheet. I don't want to spend too long on it, but it also kind of looks at like bribing, right? And like, how does that pay back? And how do you make this balance? And then for us, right, not being entirely curve pilled, right? The other question that we have is like, what are the other situations in which like you can do this, right? And like, what are these ratios? Like where can you find the best deal? Like if you're a DAO and you want liquidity, where can you get the most emissions and therefore hopefully the most liquidity? I guess that also, the other issues of, I think what you need to attract liquidity is emissions, right? It needs to be like on a trusted platform. And then there's something about the tech, right? So like a stable swap for dollars is going to be able to attract a lot more liquidity than a sushi pool because it functions better. So I think that's kind of, just in terms of how you think about VE, I think this is a really good way to do it. And I would encourage you to go spend some time and look at this sheet that Poe forked, but did some more work on, as he just commented. So that's how Poe thinks about Convex, right? And now we get into the unlockening, right? Like since the launch of bveCVX, like I was always saying, like we need to be mindful of this withdraw scheduling, right? Like we need to think about this because the whole idea of bveCVX is that it's supposed to be liquid and like you're supposed to be able to withdraw. And so the more smooth we have of a curve here, right? The more we have like a regular amount or a semi-regular amount of convex unlocking every week, the better the UX is, the more often the pool's going to arb back to peg, and it kind of means that like users have liquidity. So like at the very beginning, I was really kind of trying to make some moves. This little thing was where I got in a little bit of trouble with Convex for like arbing our pool a little bit too far out of peg to try to keep like some a smooth schedule here. But I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Right. And then if you kind of look at what happened at the Convex level, right, like this was the first voting round. Everybody was excited. Convex had been out for a while. Everybody locked their CVX. Right. Then there was, like week after week, and Convex was being emitted, and, some people were locking it, some people were trading it. So it's a little bit of bumpy, but you've got like pretty nice, like everybody's depositing. There's going to be stuff unlocking every week. Like the future is looking relatively liquid at this point. Right. And then what's interesting is this was like when the first, in April, when this first epoch after December all unlocked, and there was a lot of like FUD around maybe everybody's gonna like sell their convex or like oh no, and there's some FUD on the market, and I think like convex holders, in their Discord, their community is strong. They're like no FUD, like no, like buy more, lock it, and there was a real like strong push by the whole community to be like we're gonna kill this FUD, like we're gonna show people that like like this big cliff doesn't mean anything and nobody's gonna dump no nothing, and they locked a whole bunch more, right? So then we kept going like this again for a while, and I'll tell the story of bveCVX a little bit more, but like there was a while where the value proposition for bveCVX wasn't very good, and during that time we weren't taking any in, right? But like coming out of into this new epoch, I said like, hey, like we really like all of our people now, like their CVX is unlocking, right? Like, everybody on the team, like we can't slack anymore. Like if we don't deal this with now, like with the situation now, everybody's going to leave, right? And so we started changing bveCVX. You start seeing that it became an attractive product again, which meant that like people were depositing, right? And we started having a good curve and everything looked nice, right? And then the Black Swan event happened. So I didn't have time to look for the article, but you can find it. Basically, there was some issue in the Convex locker, and the team decided to unlock all of the tokens, right, all at once, and kind of just start over in order to deal with, I think, a security issue, right? So what happened is like the last time, right, where there was this great show of confidence. So now like all of the Convex that's been locked in this entire epoch unlocked all at once, right? And you had the great strong show of support from convex holders, right, that came in and locked 27 million convex. So that's like more than a quarter of the total supply. And at that point, it was probably, I don't want to quote numbers, but it was significantly more of the circulating supply, right? They just came and they locked it all, right? And then the second week, there were a few people that locked more, right? But then what you see, and again, like these numbers, 6 million, I can't compare them all. But then what you see is that relatively there wasn't that much locking. And really, like if you look here, like the amount of locking, right, that is happening is very little. So now we're kind of in this situation where next week, all of this unlocks. And the market's been kind of beaten down, and there's, like a few stable coins have kind of failed and gotten too big to fail. And in my mind, like a little bit and like getting swept up in all of the bribery and kind of like, yeah, how much money can we extract out of this now, right? That kind of helped to create the stablecoin bubble, which again is not saying that Curve's a bad idea and isn't saying that this kind of a system isn't great. But I do think you need to focus on a balance between like innovation and profit seeking, right? Like this sort of a thing should be used to like promote innovation. So anyway, now there's a lot of FUD in the market. And the big question that everybody has is like, how many of these people are gonna like relock, and how many of these people are done, right? How many of these people they've round trip, they've gone up and down. There's been like lots of stuff, and how many people are ready to just exit the curve war and can't. And I think, like I don't know, the whole market's abuzz with it, but fundamentally, like that's what the whole unlocking is about, right? Is like this is the story. This is where we got this big lock happened, and now this is going to happen. My one advice to any and all convex holders, right, is that like this is an ecosystem, and we are all participants in it. And if we end up with this again in the next epoch, then we're setting ourselves up for like another iteration of this, right? For like another cliff, another problem. Like we'll talk about it later for bveCVX, it's not bad because bveCVX actually has some solutions there that help a little bit. But the healthy thing for the convex ecosystem is not for all of these 20, all of this convex to relock to show your support. It's great that you show you support convex, right? Like HODL, but if everybody could just like lock their convex over like at least like 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, like slowly and smoothly, then at least like we're starting to move back towards something that looks like this, right? A good schedule that allows a healthy ecosystem, right? Instead of ending up in this like epoch that almost like has to lead to a death spiral every 6 months. So yeah, that's my story about Convex and the Unlockening. Maybe I'll stop for a minute. And anybody have any questions? Wasabi, you have any questions?
I do not have any questions on that. If anyone has a question, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. You don't need to raise your hand or anything, and ask away.
Okay, good. I'm assuming that like we've talked about this a lot, and I think most people understand most of this, but it's just good to create context, right? So bring in bveCVX. Let's start here actually and come back to bveCVX. Right? So I wrote an article in the last one called Introducing Gravity, where we kind of discuss the evolution of our influence thinking, right? And that kind of starts with the story of bveCVX. And so fundamentally, right, and Poe has a lot more details and could write a different kind of analysis here that is probably a little more economic and like mathematically absolute and factual and accurate. But in terms of understanding kind of what's going on, fairly anecdotally, right, our goal was to create Bitcoin yields with Convex. When we launched, like Votium wasn't strong. It wasn't really clear, like, hey, what are people going to do with this Convex? It's the problem I talked about before, right? You've got holders that have it. You've got DAOs that need it. Like, we don't want to buy it all. We can't afford it. But like maybe we can throw Badger emissions at this bveCVX, have people come in and then use those yields to vote, or use those votes to vote for yields on Bitcoin, which then we can farm and make fees out of, right? And we had this whole phase of our DAO where we were kind of focusing on a flywheel that was built around using Badger to trigger votes on Convex, using the votes on Convex to trigger yields on Bitcoin, creating farms to farm the Bitcoin, and then trying to extract kind of enough fees to like feed that whole ecosystem. And yeah, I think in the end, like particularly in the case of Bitcoin, what we ended up with was like too much external capital, right, that came in to farm the yields that we were creating through this whole system, but weren't putting in any convex into the system, weren't providing any vote weight, right? And some of them like weren't holding their badger, right? And it just became something that like we weren't able to sustain. It wasn't profitable and it wasn't working, right? So we started out kind of thinking like, hey, let's try to figure out how to, like make yields on Bitcoin with Convex. And I think we learned a lot there. Again, you can read this a little bit more to see about our learnings. But then, and as I said, like as we were going into that second epoch and our yields were low, and like I can go back up here and you'll see like we were kind of in this drought where like Convex yields were going up and up and up, and our yields were going down and down and down and down, and like and the liquidity at the same time, right, was going, and I can get back to that, but the liquidity was going down, right, like the whole situation was bad, and we just had to fix it. So most of my first half of the year was spent kind of working with the community and Poe largely, right, to go through a process. And if you look at this bveCVX channel, you'll see there's all these sheets, right? We went through a process of discussing with everyone, what should we do? How should we try to work this system? It got to the point where voting for bribes is just more efficient than trying to vote for pools, right? Partially because it is in a lot of senses, and also partially because then we could direct all of the emissions through our protocol, which meant that these people that were just kind of coming in and trying to take yields without contributing anything else weren't able to do so. But fundamentally, yeah. Well, let me get back to it. So yeah, so that was kind of our learning there, and where we ended up with bveCVX as we came into it is that we've actually got this product that is able to vote. It's able to manage CVX very, very well. We've figured out how to like harvest bribes, and the main issue is that we're paying them to Bitcoin holders instead of to the people in the set, right? So over time, we figured out how to restructure it, and bveCVX has now functionally become very much like an all-purpose generalized convex product that really has nothing to do with Bitcoin and is just focused on generating yields on convex. So kind of, I guess, going back to the story, right? Like DAO Watch is my little hobby of trying to collect some like real-time data and be able to make maps of it. Here's a bunch of stuff about bveCVX. This probably isn't the best dashboard to show things, and I'll get down to liquidity in a little while. So anyway, when you think about like, the way, one of the things we're trying to figure out how to do is really present what the new bveCVX is, right? Like the evolution of bveCVX, it was originally marketed as a Bitcoin supporting product into what it is today. It was very much like a community driven thing that kind of just evolved over time. And even, like a few weeks ago, I went and I looked at the documentation for it, and it was still talking about, like yields on Bitcoin and blah, blah, blah. So we realized like, hey, we need to clean this up and kind of represent it. And one of the things that we said is like we really need to give people a better view to understand this vault, right? This isn't a normal vault. So we're working on this. It's a new like set page for bveCVX. But fundamentally, what's different about it is that we've got this like text summary here that provides a little bit more information about like how the strategy works, what it does, and provides like more information to the kinds of like analytics that we're talking about. Right. We've also like broken down the fees better, because what we find is when people see like a 15% fee, it's bad. Right. But when they realize that like 10% of these fees are going to like support liquidity, support the product, support the things that they're doing, right, then it makes sense to people. So we've taken the time to make sure we do that right. And then the other thing we kind of did is, because bveCVX is semi-withdrawable, like one of the questions is how do I get it out now, and like how much would I pay to swap? So we've kind of included the percent slippage that you'd pay on a 10,000 bveCVX swap. And then the last thing that like, and we'll get into this later, is like actual performance, right? Like how much is this thing earning? There's so many factors in it, right? There's like the bribes, there's like what is voted for, there's then when you sell the bribes, and like there's all these different coins, and there's a lot of pricing. So like while everybody can kind of talk about the function of various CVX wrappers and management products, right? The actual and the value proposition and how it works, right? The actual performance is very much dependent on like some factors that aren't do not come through at all in the product proposition. And so the way we tried to do this is say, all of this dollar-based averaging and that kind of stuff makes it less clear. And that's already covered here in this APY math. So down here, we're going to just show you every vote round, right? How many Badger, how many bveCVX did you get for that 100 CVX? And then if you want to sit here and spend your time and again, do this kind of analysis work, look at this, look at the yields, try to find a graph for yields, and we'll keep developing this and like understand what's going on, right? We're giving you the availability to do so. We're trying to provide like the transparency to actually help you understand instead of just waving our hands around. So yeah, okay, so let's kind of now get into like the liquid locking industry, right? So over time, like there's a lot of steps involved in managing and in making yields off Convex, right? First, you have to lock it, you have to relock it every 2 weeks. Snapshot voting, you have to vote every 2 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a bunch of tools that exist to help you do that, right? So the first tool that existed from the very beginning was this Votium delegate, which I already showed you. That was the thing that like balanced across all of the rewards, right? I think the next tool that showed up on this list was bveCVX, like the Bitcoin edition, right, which was trying to manage it. But where you kind of ended up with the state of CVX farming is that basically you either had to go every week and make sure that you're in the snapshot and vote on the same token, right? Because otherwise you just got too many different coins and it was dust and like you'd spend too much on gas. So you would really have to like be actively engaged in voting for farming. Like if you're really into frax and you want to vote for frax and you want to deposit your frax and you're like super engaged in that ecosystem, then the whole Votium thing worked really well, just being a direct Votium user. But otherwise it didn't work so well. So the people at llama.air Force put together this thing called Union, where basically you're able to direct your bribes to Union. So you're able to like delegate your votes to Votium. You direct your bribes to Union, right? And then they basically sell it all for you, put it into, now I guess they've got a few different auto compounders, right, that are auto compounding it for you, and then emit you those tokens. So they've got a system that does that, right? Again, the difference is that you're locking everything, you're managing your locking. In a sense, you have control, a little more control of your tokens, right? Like your CVX is locked in your wallet. But in another sense, like it's not liquid. And yeah, and you at least have to like, the simplest thing you could do with Union would be to just kind of set it and forget it. And as long as you remember to show up and lock your Convex again in 16 weeks or claim it and withdraw it, right? Like that kind of works. bveCVX has the advantage of the fact that you don't have to deal with that and it's liquid. So let's just kind of look at like, again, talking about performance, right? I took a little bit of time to put this together. So this is just based on and I've checked with, I've kind of checked this quite a bit. These are like the fees that these various products claim to take, right? And I believe them. So there's fees on bribes, right? There's fees on then auto compounding stuff. There's potentially like withdrawing yields. There's potentially withdrawing the initial capital, right? Then you get some fees, and then you can basically take a like $50,000 token, whatever deposit, right? Assuming the prices don't change, and you can just kind of look and say, hey, if I put the same amount of money into all three of these things, like how much would I come out with? And so I guess the one point on this is that Pyrex charges a 1 to 5% withdraw of capital fee. I haven't quite wrapped my head around it yet, and I haven't really used it, or I don't think they have withdrawals yet, right? Because everything's still locked. So in trying to summarize, like I've summarized Pyrex as 1 to 5 is 2.5, but realized that this is somewhat variable. But like what you can see here is that actually in the end, like there's not that much difference in performance, right? Union seems to, yield a little bit more, right? Pyrex seems to like kind of yield a little bit less, but like you're talking about $540,000 versus $530,000. It's not like, it doesn't actually seem to me like this is the thing that we should be talking about when we're trying to think about what locker we're going to choose, right? So if we're talking about liquid lockers like Badger and Pyrex, right, then the main value proposition is the management and the liquidity, right? And so if we look at liquidity, which is the thing we look at, right, we want to think about the health of the pool. So here, again, from Dow Watch, like over this epoch, is like the convex price and the percentage of bveCVX in the pool. And you can see it's a bit messy here, but basically, when this number is close to the red line, then like things are very, very healthy, right? And when this number starts getting pretty high, right, we start to enter into a situation where you're paying 5, 6, 7, 8% to swap out, right? And then also like when if we're wanting to add lending, right, when we get up this high, we start to get into a situation where like a large liquidation may not even be able to happen because there's not enough tokens in the pool. So like really, like we're trying to figure that out, but that's how I think about liquidity. And as you can see, like we've stayed pretty close to the red line most of the time. What happens is when convex price starts to crash, right, bveCVX holders are like, oh, okay, I can exit, right? And then this tends to go up. It creates an RBOP. There's a bunch of trading. And somehow it, like when I see this go back down, I actually kind of see it as a sign of like early sign of market confidence in CVX, right? Like there's people saying like, okay, cool, there's a discount on bveCVX. If you're smart right now, frankly, you can also see that it's all going to unlock in a few weeks, right? So anyway, that's kind of how I look at liquidity. Unfortunately, like Pyrex has only been around for a few weeks now, I think. So like you can't really, it would be nice to be able to like compare these two things across these two protocols, but we can't really. So what I did was took like a snapshot, right? And so basically same thing that we did on the app, right? Like this is the thing that I think you should always ask yourself is like, okay, it's liquid, it's locked. How much am I going to get if I try to swap 10K or whatever your number is? But I think like 1 is a bad number, right? Like 10K is something. And you can see here that like right now the Badger pool is more balanced than Pyrex. It's bigger than Pyrex. And yeah, it looks healthier. That being said, the Pyrex pool is newer, it's smaller, and I think Pyrex is working on a gauge, and they have a lot of convex, right? So depending on what their strategy is, and I'm not sure, Like one would think that like eventually, like if they can throw enough vote weight at this pool and get their gauge and figure out a way to incentivize it, really, like they can get more liquidity. And then assuming that their product works well and people like it and like it's functioning right, and you don't have a situation like we had a while ago where everybody wants out because it's just kind of not, like people aren't getting what they want out of it, right? Then one would assume that like that maybe Pyrex can get to a similar point, but like right now they're not. So taking my Badger hat off right now, if I were gonna like lock my Convex, what I would say is, first of all, maybe it makes sense to try a few things. Maybe it makes sense to split your risk, right? But I think Union and bveCVX to me both look like a little bit more mature, um, and yeah, and like stable, and I don't right now see the direct value proposition of Pyrex. That being said, what Pyrex is running right now is this easy mode, which isn't actually their main product, right? And so if you go look into Pyrex and what they're doing, they've got a lot of cool stuff that they're trying to build on top of that, right? And if you're interested in that value proposition, then I think over time it's really interesting to look in that. But they're definitely the new kid on the block. So now that's the other way that everybody tries to talk about Convex, and I hate it because it's bullshit, is real performance, right? So I showed this before, like Convex Llama has this, here's this APR. If you look, Pyrex posted an article and they said, here's the APR that Pyrex is getting, and it's based on this, right? And then also Badger's APR. So let's start with like Pyrex and talk about, or Union, and talk about like kind of how this is calculated, right? And what the challenges are there. So the way that Union calculates their yields is at the end of the voting round, right? At the second that the snapshot ends, they take the USD values of all of the bribes, right? Then, 8 to 12 to maybe a little bit more hours later, like you can actually claim these tokens, right? But this value is based on the USD value of all of the bribes at the point of snapshot end versus the current value of CVX. So what that means is that like if the market's going down, right, you snapshot all these tokens, cool, you've got a yield. Then over that 2 weeks, the CVX keeps going down because the market's going down, right, and the yield goes up. But that's not a great yield, right? Like that's kind of like this yield is only really actually accurate like right at the time of snapshot. And then to a certain extent, like you're not actually able, and that's why I said, can you get these ROIs? And maybe, right? But in order to even get these ROIs, like this situation has to hold until you're able to claim and sell the tokens. And then also like if everybody claims and sells the tokens, like, yeah. So it's not perfect, right? And it's not like when you're sitting there going, I'm going to compare these two numbers, like it's not something that you should be doing or that works, right? And then if we think about Badger's APY, right, like what we do is we look at the performance kind of like a weighted, and maybe Jindao could do a whole session on this, right? He can speak in a lot more detail to me than me, but at least in V1 Vault, what we're doing is just looking at the last 21 days and taking some sort of a time weighted average performance, right? So that also has a lot of the similar problems, not so much like this split in time thing that's going on with Union, but that has a lot of the same problems in that, like at a certain point, we claim all these coins and then we sell them for bveCVX and Badger. And based on that specific sales price, and then based on the movement of Badger against bveCVX, based on all those coins and when they move, right? Like there's these events where things are emitted that happen like once every 2 weeks, right? And then there's some kind of just average being taken of that over a short period of time based on all of this like volatility that's trying to show you this yield. So like, I don't really think that in the end, if you want to understand the performance of a wrapper, that's a very good way to do it either, right? And I think this, this mock-up and this view down here of like, let me actually look at what I got paid, and then like I can do the dollar math, right? Like I can decide how I want to value this, but like let me have the real data, let me have some summaries, like let me get more so that I can think about this in a few different ways is a much better way to think about it. We were trying to get an analyst to do like real time or a like a real performance or a real analysis of real time performance, right? So the question is, and it's still being worked on, and I'm hoping it comes together. But I'll talk about some of the challenges in a second. But the question was similar to this one, right? If I were to invest, I think it was like 10,000 or some amount of money in all of these protocols and hodl everything, right? Not take the full value proposition until now, right? And then sell everything now. Like, what is the USD value of what I have, right? And so if we want to actually look at like how, and again, it's harder to do with Pyrex, although it's easier to do interpolate off of Pyrex because Pyrex is based on Votium or on unions logic, right? So maybe you could kind of try to interpolate with just a change of the fees or whatnot. But anyway, I'm hoping that that comes out. We're working on it, and then I'll get into challenges, right? The challenges is that I think at the beginning of this epoch, in the middle of this epoch, we've changed how we handle bribes, right? So at the beginning, there was a multi-sig doing it. And then now we've built this kind of like more trustless, decentralized version that bounds the authority of the multi-sig and what they can do. Again, I think maybe we'll try to get Alex to come talk about that at some point. But we have this system, so we've changed. Like the events are different. There's a lot changed. So if you're trying to analyze it, like different things have happened on the Badger side. On the union side, you have a lot of similar problems and even more interesting problems, right? They were earning, for example, Terra for a long time because when you delegate to Votium, you get all of the, or Luna, sorry, when you delegate to Votium, you get all of the tokens. So they're getting Luna, lots of it, right? Because they're kind of yield farming for like a bunch of Votium, and we weren't voting for it, right? We can control what we vote. So I talked to Eleanor all the time, and we were joking about it, and they were telling me, that's where all the Luna came from. But anyway, they get the Luna, and the only way to really sell it is you have to like bridge it to Terra, sell it, and then bridge the money back. So like there was a time where like Union was doing that every 2 weeks, right? Or I think for a while there was like some Geist being emitted or so. Trying to like look at Union and understand exactly like what they did or how they performed is also fairly complicated, and they've also like grown and adapted, and everybody's kind of like been building during this time. And so yeah, like we've got some poor analysts trying to like talk to everybody and understand WTF happened, and hopefully, hopefully like my little oh my god confused guy, like we can provide some like insights and shine a light through the trees. And as you can see in my analysis, right, my goal is not to like say, hey, Badger's best, right? Like I'll tell you that like Llama has lower fees, and like I'm happy. I just want there to be like truth, and I want us to be thinking based on data and not based on like big green numbers that we see, and it's kind of like one versus the other. And I encourage you when you're thinking about your lockers and how to do this to think about that. Any questions about any of that?
So I wonder if we could just take a second and sharpen the distinctions and between the three options, right? Because you say you're admitting that Llama has slightly lower fees, but the real issue there is two things, right? So one reason that you would pick Badger over Llama in this case is if you want the optionality to exit early through the curve pool. And number two, there's a difference in the reward tokens that you're getting, right? So with Badger, you're getting a mix of 75% bveCVX auto compounding and 25% Badger. So that's beneficial to the Badger ecosystem. If you have a view on the Badger token, that's certainly part of the consideration. And then also you get some of the CVX CRB that is auto compounding in our vault. And if you are with Union, you cannot exit early because you're locked up in the bveCVX contract, and you are not getting CVX auto compounding. You are getting everything sold into their compounding CVX CRB, right? So you're paying slightly less fees for that, but it's a different exposure to the reward tokens.
Yeah, agreed. But again, like to me, like I would have talked about it more but I don't want to get deep into it because until like I have a chart that says like, okay, so there's some different strategies, right? There's some different reward tokens, but like, how did they perform? If I had 100, if I had $50,000 and I invested in all these things with all of these considerations in mind, how do they perform? And I think like we'll be writing more about it, right? But like, I don't really want to get like deep into those details right now because I think like to talk about them accurately, we need to like write them down. But yeah, I agree. Like if you just talk about the USPs of each of these protocols really quick, and let's do that one more time, right? So I think the USP of Badger is, and like I've talked to a lot of people about it, and most people agree, like bveCVX has the best UX, right? Like you just put your tokens in, you get yields, everything's like super auto compounding for you. It works. You can go claim, like you can get out when you want to, unless you like deposit like 100,000 of them, and then you can only get out sometimes, right? Like maybe you'll pay some fees, but like all of the options are there, and you never have to do anything, right? And then as Wasabi said, right, like it's interacted with Boost, and if you want, right, it's a good doorstep or kind of doorway into the whole Badger ecosystem, right? And you can get involved in the DAO, and it kind of ties into some of our other products, right? So, but for bveCVX, it's really like the UX, the liquidity, the locking management, that is like our USP, our strength, like where I will confidently say that right now, like Badger is the best, right? I think what Union is good at is like they do the least in a sense, right? Like you have the custody of your tokens, right? Like you're voting, like you can vote for whatever you want and delegate to Union, and they'll sell it for you. So like they're the least involved and at any point you've got your tokens locked, you've got the full custody, and if you want, like you could delegate your rewards to someone else, you could delegate your votes to someone else, you could vote for something else, right? Like they take the least, they do the least, right? And they give you the kind of the most control, but that is at the cost of UX, right? And that's at the cost of liquidity. And then Pyrex is a new kid on the block, right? Like they have a bunch of really cool ideas to, the other people that are the new kid on the block and their product's not really done yet is like Clever, who's kind of trying to build an Alchemix thing on top, right? But Pyrex to me kind of represents these like people that are coming with like derivatives on top of that, right? That have the ability to be like super interesting. And I think like if you're interested in that and you get into this ecosystem, right? Like, if that goes well, if that all happens, right? Like then you've got the opportunity to play with that. But my theory, and I guess this is kind of maybe none of these people are listening, but I think a lot of people are tired of the curve wars. Right? I think a lot of people are tired of the curve wars. They've been like dealing with bribes and all of this stuff for a long time. I think that probably a lot of people are going to like sell their CVX when it unlocks because they're going to exit. And then I think it's like on fire sale. And so I think then what's left is you have people that are like, okay, like people that want to still fight, right? The people that are like, I don't want to fight anymore, but I want to like hang on to my bags. And then you've got a bunch of new entrants that are coming in going like, hey, like here's this token that like costs nothing and has like really high yields, and I'm gonna like buy the dip, right? And so to me, like our main market are the people that are tired of it and new entrants that just want yields, right? That don't want to think about the rest of it. And like when I kind of think about who the key customers are for Badger, it's like people that want to like farm convex and not really deal with the curve wars. Or if they're gonna deal with the curve wars, come join our DAO and be part of all of these conversations, right? And do so like as a collective, trying to think about how we manage influence like in ecosystems. So yeah, I guess that is that kind of what you're looking for, Wasabi?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it strikes me, and maybe you didn't want to go here, but like, yes, and we've talked about this offline, but the big decision, if the fees are more or less equal, there are kind of these pretty nuanced differences between the three options. The real question that people are going to have when this unlock happens is, what is the future of the curve wars? Are DAOs going to still need to buy CVX? What is the trend lines on Votium? Like, what is the income level going to be over the next 6 months or 12 months? So like, do you have a strong view on that? I mean,
No,
is that not
no,
something we want to get into here?
no. No, I don't know. Like I first of all, like we are in unprecedented times, right? Like on a number of different layers in this regard, right? And second of all, like I don't really do speculation or technical analysis, right? So like I don't know, like, but what I can say is that like somebody will own the CVX, right? And whoever owns the CVX, like, and there will be some yields. And whoever owns the CVX is going to want to get those yields without having to deal with all this crap. I think. Like, I think that's the thing I'm more sure about. Is that like that's more the point that people are at. Is like it's a thing I want yields. Like I don't really want to deal with it all. And that's fundamentally, to some degree, what all these things are about. Is like at least you know handling a lot of that for you, and then in some cases like creating a little bit of a new metagame, right? I think that's what Pyrex is really trying to do on top. Yeah. And again, I think the other thing that a lot of people think about is like trust, right? Like trust and decentralization are a big issue. And like let me just go through that because it's important to think about, right? Like we've worked very, very, very hard to try to decentralize bveCVX as much as possible, right? What that means, I talked a little bit about the bounded bribes processor, and again, I'm hoping like we can get Alex on a pod or something to talk about it more, right? Like the voting automation is very tricky because it's snapshot, so it has to happen off chain. And so like that does happen by a bot, and there's like too much centralization there in our minds for anyone, right? But we're really working on trying to kind of deal with that, right? And that's a problem that Votium has. And I think like on the handling of bribes thing, it's like the union does not have the same safeguards in place. I do think they have a multi-sig. Sometimes they've got to put stuff on an EOA to bridge it to another chain. But everybody trusts them, right? Like they do have a lot of trust in the ecosystem. I think actually all of these parties. I think Badger, Union, and I think Redacted. I guess they haven't really run vaults a lot, but are reasonably like trusted custodians, right? And the other thing that I think is worth looking into, and like we can put more out about it, and we can talk about it on podcasts, is like like who's got your bags? How much control over do you have over them? How much control do they have over them? Right? Like what could go wrong, and just kind of that line of thinking. And so I think that's the other thing people are thinking about or should be thinking about. So yeah, does that answer your question? I mean, unfortunately, and maybe like what you want me to say is that one's better, but like honestly, looking at all of this, like they're not that different, right? In terms of performance or in terms of proposed performance, right? They're not that different. Like you could look at this again. The question is largely like the UX that you're looking for. And then again, like I guess from an economic point of view, I think like what Poe or a lot of people would argue is that like liquidity is like can save your ass, right? Liquidity has real value, and you are paying for it with bveCVX. That's one of the reasons our fees are higher. Okay, so in being responsible custodians of liquid tokens and kind of looking at everything that happened over the last month or two, like we kind of took Tetranode. Tetranode was talking about it a lot, and we said, like maybe we should look at the A factor of bveCVX and see if we can kind of try to maintain a better balance. And Freddie kind of put this all together. He's on the council, Badger Council. Are you here, Freddie? Do you want to just talk about this real quick?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So, hey, first of all, do those charts not speak for themselves?
Yeah.
Sorry. Hey, can you go back to that, the BV Convex Pyrex? I think you had the curve images. There was one that showed them side by side in curve. I think it's down. Yeah, is that them? Yeah. So, Curve had a number of innovations, and the key one was around stable swaps and lowering fees and reducing slippage on large transactions. And so, to understand what we're proposing, I'm going to just use an example of a stablecoin swap in a traditional market maker like Uniswap. So, in Uniswap, if you have a $200 million pool and half of that is USDC and half is USDT. And somebody wants to come in and make a $50 million swap. So essentially half on each side. What they would do is they would, let's say, take out 50 million USDC and put in 50 million USDT. And now what you have in the pool is an imbalanced pool where you have only $50 million in USDC left, but now you have $150 million in USDT. And that creates a lot of slippage for the person that affects that transaction. And it actually changes the price, right? Now USDC, if you just take that transaction in isolation, is worth essentially 1/3, right? 50 million of, that 150 million USDT that's in there. So it creates price slippage, and it creates slippage for the person that affects that transaction. And then it requires somebody to come in and arb that pool back into balance. And what Curve did is they created something called an A factor, which just changed, it uses the same automated market maker formula and modifies it so that the A factor changes the curve. And you can set an A factor of 0, and it doesn't change the curve at all. It'll act just like Uniswap. Or you can go to what is essentially infinity. And what happens when you go to infinity is it just changes where that price slippage occurs. So on the 3 pool right now, I think it started at, when they first opened the pool, it started at 5,000, I think, and now it's sitting at 2,000. And the pool is balanced, I think 60% USDT and then 20% each for DAI and USDC. And even with the balance changing like that, the price for a swap doesn't change. It stays very stable. And that's by design because of that A factor. The higher the A factor, the further down the curve it pushes any type of pricing slippage as the pool becomes imbalanced. And what happened was during the market stress of UST, the BVE convex and convex pool became imbalanced. It was about, as I recall, 70% convex, 30% BVE convex. And that was because BVE convex was locked in Badger and people wanted to get it out, right? So they started depositing more BVE convex and taking out convex. And it got us dangerously close to where the price slippage would happen. And the problem with high A factors is that when the price slippage starts, it cascades pretty quickly and it can create a panic. And so we reached out to a member of the Curve team and had them run some models for us. And that's actually what was on the original chart that that Tritium had up. And I just want to point out before we, so we're moving on, but in that chart he was showing right there, the A factor of Pyrex, I think, was 50. The A factor of BVE convex is 100 right now. So our price will be more stable until it's not, and then it will slip faster, right? That's essentially what the situation is. So we worked with Curve, and they have a pretty complex modeling system. Their models look at, as you change the A factor, what does it do to the pool balance, the daily volume, the price variance, the returns on fees in the pool? And their recommendation was somewhere between 30 and 50 was appropriate for a pool like ours in times of market stress. And that's essentially what these charts are showing. And so we elected to split the difference and go with 40, right halfway between the 30 and the 50 they recommended, and put the proposal out on the Curve forum, and now there's a vote to ratify that. And essentially what it'll do is it'll create opportunities for market participants to arbitrage the BVE convex out of the pool, essentially buy the BVE convex out of the pool as it becomes, as the pool becomes imbalanced, and create the incentive to do it earlier than they would today. And that'll just create a more orderly market for BVE convex.
The other thing that I would add to that is that our vaults buy BVE convex out of this pool, right? So when we're auto compounding bveCVX, we're buying it. So like when there is an RBOP, we take it with bveCVX, and we are kind of very often like the primary force bringing the pool back to peg. And what happens is it gets like dangerously low and there's like problems. And then eventually like somebody else arbs it. But like bveCVX isn't getting as much of the arb as I would like to see it to get, right? And I think that having a lower A factor will mean that like you get more money for arbing the pool sooner, which is I think good for the pool. It's good for like arbs, and like it's good for us because we are the biggest arb.
Yeah, and I mean, in full transparency too, what it's going to do is it's just going to increase the price variance sooner in the curve, and it's going to make it a little bit more expensive for somebody to get out right earlier in the cycle if there's a rush to the exit. I mean, that's the flip side of that. So it's balancing, keeping the pool balanced, creating some incentives for arbitrage, and also some disincentives for big moves.
Cool. Any questions about that? You know, the one thing I'd say is like, so when we talk about gravity, right? Like one of the things that I think is important, again, like particularly in these markets, is to like go deep, right? Like if we're gonna do influence, then like let's understand how these pools work. Let's really understand how these tokenomics work. Like let's engage with the smartest people and have those sorts of conversations. And you know, one of the reasons I put this here is to show that like we're working with the community, we're working with the council, right? And like the more people that we have, you know, like kind of around us, like doing this kind of work and working together, right? Like the quicker we can learn, and in my mind, hopefully the quicker we can get to like good sustainable solutions. And yeah, if you want to go vote on this, click here. You can. We'll download this later. So that's the end of my Convex spiel, and now it's time to talk about Aura for a little bit. Wasabi, I mean, do you want to go back around and summarize that all a little bit more? Is there anything else? Any questions? Any more curve stuff before we move on?
No, I think, over the next coming week, we are going to be putting out more stuff. We have more FAQ type stuff that just tries to reintroduce bveCVX to the community and suggest that people consider it as the unlocking takes place, and are just going to be trying to get that message out in as many different ways as possible. If you know people who are big in the Curve Convex community, we'd be happy to talk with them or set up other conversations. But I think we're good to move on to Aura now.
Yeah, and
hey,
I guess
Trent, one thing I was gonna one thing before we move on, I think is something that was kind of overlooked, especially when looking at the comparisons between, the different options, was obviously something that's paused now, but it was the leverageability of bveCVX, which at least for me is a big plus versus kind of the other options. And I think we also, some of the implications when we were talking about the bveCVX and CVX pool was if you lack liquidity there, then it makes allowing bveCVX to be leverageable and get bad debt and all that kind of thing. So as someone who looks forward to kind of that spigot being turned back on, do you have any comments on that situation, kind of the thoughts from kind of the internal team? Obviously on council, we discussed this kind of privately, but would love to hear kind of your thoughts for the broader community as well.
Okay, so yeah, and thinking about, again, I'm going to try to zoom out and then back in for a minute. So, if we go back to thinking about lockers, right, like one of the things that liquidity allows is borrowing, right? Because if you have to be able to liquidate in order to have collateralized debt, but if you can liquidate, then people can borrow against it, right? And we were doing that for a while in Rari until they had an exploit. So the amount, and like we were moving slow and we're still kind of like trying to figure it out, but it's a little challenging because in thinking about like how much borrowing you can allow, right? It basically, like if your liquidation ratio is 15%, right? Then kind of the question is like, how much CVX can I sell for, like less than that? And again, the problem with the pool before was that like it could get to the point where there was like 20,000 CVX in it or like 15,000 CVX in it, and it was only trading at like a 2 or 3% discount, right? But then there's like 40,000 CVX on Rari, and you're looking at it going like, like this looks good for users, but like this liquidation these liquidations cannot happen. And so one of the things that like raising, and we have to raise it and see what happens, right? But one of the things that raising the A factor will do is hopefully mean that it gets ARB further, right? And that like within that 10 to 15% range that like a liquidation can happen and be profitable, there's a lot more liquidity there. So like that's one thing, right? The second thing that kind of, so that's one thing that helps, right? Then the size of the amount of liquidity that you have, right? The more liquidity you have, like clearly the more you can liquidate, right? And so when thinking about locking liquidity, it's not just the pool, right? It's also this. And so the thing is, like, we were working so hard on liquidity, right? Like, that's what all of this was about, was being like, hey, like, if we can just get a pretty smooth curve and like, like even if we miss a week, cool. But like, if there's always a pretty big unlock coming soon, then kind of like it's better, right? Because we know the pool's going to arb back on a pretty regular basis. But here you can see, like, we didn't do a bad job, right? Like, this is huge, but like over the next epoch, like there's a number of times where like a decent number of tokens unlock, and where like if the pool's off peg, like it can be our back. So that's like, I guess the second thing that we kind of think about is liquidity in general, right? And then the third issue is just like finding a good lending platform that isn't, like such like, I don't know, like with Rari, there's been like a lot of security issues. There's still like, like we missed that boat, thankfully, but like we really don't want to get tied up in more of that, right? And so my mind is that like, and maybe we'll look back at that like once everything sorted out with Rari, but in my mind, like the direction to move is focused more on like some sort of a CDP, like a collateral debt platform like Maker or MIM, or like Inverse has one, or like there's a lot of people that are making like a stable dollar based on you depositing, and kind of that sort of a model, right? And in that case, right, like just the breakup of kind of like responsibility, and like, okay, then like they're managing the tokens and that's their thing, and like we need to like make sure that they're a trusted protocol, but like we don't need to like deal with all of the thinking about liquidation, managing, whatever. We have a partner for that. So that's like one thing that I'm slowly trying to figure out, right? And then the other thing on the liquidation side, it really, really enables this, and like Citadel was going to be that, but that's like it might take a little while, is private liquidations, right? So like if you've got some DAO, be it Frax, be it whatever, that's like, hey, like if CVX is at like a 10% discount, like I'll buy it. I've got like 10 or 50,000, right? Like I'm running the bots, like we have known private liquidators lined up, right? Then that we can like account for in how we borrow or how we deal with lending, right? And the other issue, or the other thing that helps, is bveCVX, because as I said, it's buying the CVX. So the bigger bveCVX is, the more regular buy pressure there is. Again, right now it's a little harder to predict because the bribe environment is not predictable. But like, if there's predictable income coming into bveCVX and it's big, then that equates to like predictable buy pressure, right, of bveCVX, which means that you're more sure that like when you end up out of peg, right, everything's going to return back. So I know that's kind of a very like roundabout answer to your question, but I think those are the things that we need to think about. And like again, I'm happy to kind of like work with the community on it. I think like there's people in the team that have thought about it a lot. And a lot of it is like just kind of finding the right partner, right, that isn't going to cause us like security anxiety. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Talk?
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation, so I don't think the ball's moved there at all. I just thought it was as a thing to be brought up. That was kind of an outstanding bveCVX issue that is as yet unresolved. And my feeling is that it's a big differentiator. And as the DAO obviously has a lot of reasons to want to be the best place to park CVX, which I've said a lot of times. And I think that's a core part of it. And, you know, so finding a way to make that healthy and safe for the community, I think should be more of a priority, especially now that bveCVX is profitable and kind of operating in a self-sustainable way. And so I think that's really just the last piece. And so as we think about the product, it shouldn't take a back seat.
Yeah, I agree. I very much agree. You know, like we've got a team of people working on it. I will once every 2 weeks I try to like redirect focus towards it. I just don't like I don't have the skills really to like assess, right? Like for Badger to commit to another protocol or to work with partners at this point, right? Like the level of like due diligence that we do is like pretty insane, right? So like we look at all their smart contracts, we look at their team, we look at like how they've behaved, and like it's hard to, there's not like a clear like, hey, like yeah, like these guys are like good and everything's solid and there's no concerns there. And then there's like a lot of like new entrants on the market potentially, which are interesting, right? But then like again, there's like a little more risk. So it's, I mean, it's not that we're not thinking about it. It's that, you know, like Seifu first, and that one's tricky right now. But I think, you know, like again, I will next quarter try to once again like drive a little bit more focus there. And I agree, it's something that like we really want to focus on and like need to get done, and not just for bveCVX. I mean, the other issue with bveCVX is even when we get this lending thing figured out, there's also the liquidity thing. And, you know, like I'm working on everything we can to make that environment look right. But if anybody can help us like figure out how to do this like private liquidation, you know, if anybody's working with DAOs or investors or somebody that like is interested in working with us for potentially the opportunity to buy some cheap CVX, right? But helping to provide the security that that liquidity will be there when needed, that could also like help and potentially like motivate more push in that direction. So yeah, keep that in mind, or yeah, if you think of anything. Okay. Any other questions? Hang in the garbage men are. Let me go close my window real quick. It's hot, but there's garbage men. Okay. Then how are we doing on time? We've been here for about 45 minutes. Okay. So we spent most of the last. What? Oh wow.
At noon. Yeah. So.
Let me just.
And
let me just real quick in five or 10 minutes, right? So this Aura thing's still going on. If you've got BAL or veBAL, you can deposit it here. There's really good yields. It's the same thing as Convex on Balancer. The first vote is happening now, so you can go vote if you locked any Aura from the airdrop or from like staking your Balancer. Like there's a vote on right now. You can go vote for it. At the same time, like our first product is up. It's called graviAURA. Basically, we talked about that a lot that time, but it's here now. Read this article about the emissions because they're only for 5 weeks, right? But then there's all the other value propositions. So check this out. If you want to play the boost game, like you can make some pretty good, like pretty nice Badger with like some shrimp stacks at the moment. So like maybe go check that out. There's graviAURA. There's a vote going on right now in the balancer around graviAURA, so we're working on our first gauges. And there's some stuff with this whale that voted down the first gauges for Aura, and yeah, like maybe we'll do a talk about that. But the balancer wars are really heating up and becoming like, in my mind, fairly entertaining, right? Like there's a lot of action and activity there, and we're pushing forward. Yeah, here are these gauge weight votes that failed from balancer, right? And we're going to try it again. That's tricky because the Aura votes, the Aura votes for the Aura 1-to-1 on Snapchat. So like part of what we're going to need to do next week or when the Snapchat comes is really try to like rally all of the Aura holders to like vote for these gauges so that we can get some Aura liquidity, right? And kind of get them rocking and rolling a little more. And yeah, Aura is now has almost 1 million veBAL. I kind of think like, you know, the whale that's blocking their gauges is probably like most of these three and maybe like these two wallets. So there's still a ways to go before like they actually have kind of won the balancer wars in the state sense, but that's going pretty well. So yeah, go check out Aura, go check out Gravity, go read the bootstrapping and all that stuff. It's a cool, interesting thing that's going on in DeFi right now, and there's not a lot of that. That's my plug. Okay, cool. Was that quick enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we will be back next Thursday with office hours, and we can dedicate the whole chapter to a balancer wars.
Yeah, cool. Or the Unlockening, right? I mean, next week we're like deep into the Unlockening. We might just need to do like a blow by blow commentary of like the carnage. We'll see. Let's see what's going on.
And Trey, I was on my mobile, so I didn't see the graphs, but isn't there another kind of semi-big one on July 7th as well? So it's kind of like a back-to-back weeks of unlocking.
Oh, yeah. Well, so yeah, on July 7th, there is Convex has also a big chunk unlocking. And the other thing I should point out is that Badger took a week to check everything, and as I said, we're diligent. So we actually locked in the second week. There was no voting to do in this week. There's no reason to rush to lock. But what that means is that most of the bveCVX actually unlocks 1 week after the Unlockening. Although I expect a lot to flow in this week. I hope, which means that if you want to withdraw, you should be able to. But yeah, you're right. It is probably a 2-week event. I think the first week will be like when the fur is flying, right? And then the second week will be recovery and maybe like, I don't know, like where the market's been for the last week. Unsure.
I'm personally waiting until that second week to, well, you know, I'll obviously monitor it, but I'm hoping to scoop up some cheap CVX. But when everyone's hoping to scoop up some cheap CVX, we'll see if there's any cheap CVX to be scooped up. You know,
Yeah, I mean,
those
it'll be an event. I'm, you know, like I've got my popcorn.
yeah. All right. Well, I don't have any other questions. As always, appreciate this, Trent and team.
Yeah, no worries. And I think, yeah, we're pretty much at a wrap. Yeah, Wasabi?
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we will be back this same day next week to do it again. Talk to you later.
Thanks for coming. Ciao.